Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So you heard things about OData and the applications that have been compliant with OData. And here's another one that will help you to make it even easier for you to use OData. And our presenter is Carol. We had a deal not to pronounce each other's last name. Yeah, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi. So can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. My name is Carol Zadora, and I'm on the Visual Studio LightSwitch team. How many of you have heard about Visual Studio LightSwitch? I know some. I remember from OData meetup. Okay, some people. So it's a funny project. Visual Studio LightSwitch started as a tool strictly for building data-centric applications on Microsoft platform. And the primary goal was to make developers as productive as possible with this task. That is, we strive to eliminate as much of concepts as possible, as much of plumbing code as possible, and give you just an environment where you focus on your problem, on your data, and on your screens, and how this data needs to be presented. And the rest is left to the tool and to the runtime. And we shipped our first version in the middle of last year as an add-on to Visual Studio 2008. And this add-on allows you to build forms over data applications that are architecturally three-tier application. You have the server tier, the data source, and the client. And the client is a Silverlight application that can be run inside a browser or can be also deployed as a desktop application. And in the first version, the protocol between the client and the service is proprietary. I mean, it's not really a secret. It has been based on WCF RIA services, which is a Silverlight-specific way of transferring data between the service tier and the client. But in the next version that is going to ship with Visual Studio 2012, and that will be sort of delivered in the same package as Visual Studio 2012 Professional Edition or above, LightSwitch will be sort of built in. So, if you install Visual Studio 2012, you'll be able to create LightSwitch projects. And in this version, we are making a change, and now the protocol between the client application and the service is OData. And so every LightSwitch application will be an OData producer and also can be an OData consumer in the sense that you can attach to an external OData service and expose it to your clients. So I'm just hoping that today we have some sort of a conversation. I'll show you what LightSwitch will be able to do when we ship Visual Studio 2012 in terms of consuming external OData services or producing OData services from, say, database sources. There are things that LightSwitch can do in terms of OData, and there are things that LightSwitch will not be able to do in this version. And so I'd like to hear maybe from you also, is it interesting? What should we focus for the next release? Things like that.
Question.
Yes?
So would the Metro release in Windows 8 would be OData focused as far as applications communicating back?
So the question was, will the Metro release
Metro
of
meaning it supports both Windows 8 supports both Metro and the
right.
Metro apps communicating how will they be using OData as their default protocol?
So the question is whether Metro apps will be using OData as the default protocol. It's hard for me to say. I don't know for sure, but yeah, it's not like prescribed that to get the Windows 8 logo or whatever you have to use OData. That said, I think that in emerging pattern, architectural pattern for applications is that there is a service layer and there are clients. And the service layer is talking in terms of some sort of a REST interface. And if you want more sophisticated query capabilities, then OData is a natural answer to that. Okay. So in terms of how LightSwitch, just to give you a quick context, in terms of how LightSwitch development looks, is you start with a data source. You can either attach to an existing data source that can be a database or an OData feed, or you can build your own, and we'll generate a database for you. You add some information about this, your data. You define entities and properties if it's your own data source, or maybe if it's an attached data source, you decorate it with some validation information or whatever. And then you build on screens on top of that, and you run the application and start playing with it. And if you like it, great. If there are some other things that you want the application to do and the runtime doesn't provide it out of the box, then you start to refine the application. Now, in your case, if you're just interested in producing the OData service and not so much about the client application, well, you just basically iterate here and maybe use the client application as sort of a test bed, or use your own client if you have it. You don't have to invest a lot in the client, but it's there if you need it. And then you can iterate, as I said, and go back and forth between the design time and runtime. And some of the UI changes you can do even from within the runtime. So now I'll do a little demo and show you how it really looks. So this is I have a build here that is. Oops, let me connect to this machine again because resolution is not right. I want to show it in full screen. So I have a build that is pretty recent. So it might be a little slow. I apologize for that. We are sort of on the bleeding edge here. So say I want to create a new LightSwitch application, a new LightSwitch service. So I say File, New Project, and there is a LightSwitch node among other sort of project types. And the only choice that you have to make up front is whether you want to use Visual Basic or C#. So let's create a C# application. And then suppose that you have some data like, I got some data set describing earthquake data from Jan, so I'll use that. I have imported that into a SQL database. So it's there waiting for us to consume. So I could either start with creating my own entities or attaching to an external data source. In this case, I'll attach to this external data source. And when you do that, you can choose either database, OData service. We also handle SharePoint lists as data sources, and this fourth option, WCF RIA service, is sort of a throwback from our previous version, or you can connect to a RIA service directly. In this case, we'll choose the database. I'll use a local DB instance on my machine. So I have to use a spell to connect to the instance, and I have this database here. The default name that the tool is giving is not very nice. I'll call it EQ data. And I have just one table here, but if you had more tables or views or whatever, you could, pick and choose what you want. And so right now, what we have basically done is we sort of attached to this data source. And if we run this application, we haven't defined any UI. So the application will run, but will not show anything. Actually, I made one little mistake. But the OData service that is behind this application will work already and expose the earthquake data. I just need to switch from a desktop app, because right now the application is by default, we run it as a desktop application. And what I really want is I want this to be a web application so that I can show you the URLs and the traffic and convince you that this is really OData. So it's as easy as just flipping this radio button to produce a web version of this application. Also, the UI of the client, by the way, is customizable, so I can change the shell type and theme, and it will look a little bit different, and you can build your own shells, but that's maybe not so interesting right now. So let's run it again, and notice that we are connecting to a development web server that is running on my local machine. And so I can copy this fragment of the URI, which is where the service is running, and then I can try to connect to this service from PowerPivot. So we called it EQ data, so the service is eqdata.service.svc. Let's test it, and yeah, it seems to really work. So we can just hit finish, and at this point the PowerPivot will load all the data. I have about 2,000, slightly more than 2,000 rows, and here's our data, right? And so now it has been loaded, and you can use PowerPivot to do all sorts of pivoting and analysis on that data. And we didn't write any code to get this data out of the database and expose it as OData. And if you look at our venerable fiddler, you will see that am I actually capturing the traffic or not? I might not be capturing traffic right now. Let's erase that. I think I have a filter set. So if we go back to power pivot and try to refresh, okay, that won't work. But I'll show you later in the browser. So the bottom line is it's very easy to get started. Any questions so far? Okay. Yes.
Although it was a SQL Server database, you just connected to the database file, didn't require any authentication and username password.
Correct.
Tell me how we are able to bypass the SQL Server authentication services and just get into the database file.
Right. So the question is, what about authentication to the SQL? So right now, I'm actually running the development server, and everything runs in the SQL Server integrated mode and as myself under my account. So that's why everything works and there's no prompts. If you deploy the application, then of course you need to have a connection string in use, either the proper username and password, or make sure that your service is running under an account that has rights to SQL, et cetera, et cetera. What LightSwitch also has, it has a built-in notion of users, roles, and permissions. And it can, for authentication, it can use its own database of users and roles and be the identity provider sort of for itself. Or it can use Windows authentication, integrated authentication. So this is shown on this page. If you go to application properties, I don't know if you see it, you can say, by default the authentication is not enabled, but you can enable authentication, say I want to use Windows authentication or Forms authentication, which translates into ASP.NET Forms or HTTP Basic for the OData service. And then you can define permissions for users. So think about permissions as sort of an abstract designation. And in your application code, you can, or in your service code, you can say, if the current user has this permission, then I can do something else. Don't do it, right? I'll show you how to do it later on. So the first thing that you can do with this data is you can do some, attach some validation. And what this validation can do then is, if you allow some updates to your service, validation code will be run before any updates take place, and you will be able to catch any errors. So for example, say we have this magnitude property, and say you want to make sure that the value is valid. So I'm not a geologist. I don't know what is the highest possible value for magnitude. Is it like 12 in Richter scale or something like that? I don't know. But you can say something like this, so now we are sort of validating a single record in this partial method. So you can say if this magnitude, say, is greater than 12, right, then you can say, I have an error, and the error message is magnitude can only be 0 to 12 or something like that. Right? Can you guys see it, or maybe I should make it a little bit bigger? Nice. Now in Visual Studio that you can just enlarge the whole thing without messing up with fonts. So that's an example. Another example of things that you can do is you can control what happens when somebody tries to read from your feed, or add something to it, or delete. So we have those methods that we call access control methods that are like can insert, can read, can update. So for example, if you want to make the whole feed not updatable, you can just say, result from the can update on a particular entity, you can just say result of that method is false. And that will make it not updatable, just like that. And you can combine that with the permissions system. So if you go to the properties and say, okay, I want whatever, Windows authentication, or you can then create your own permission. So, say we have can permission that we call can update earthquake data, right? This will be defined in the application model. And now we can say this application, I believe, user has permission, and you can say permission can not all permissions, right? Can update earthquake data. So we say, if this is true, then the result is true, which means go ahead with the update, else result is false. So that combined with the system where you can define users and roles and assign permissions to roles and then put users into certain roles, or even you can use Windows groups to associate them with roles, gives you a lot of flexibility because you don't have to write a code that says, oh, if this user is in this role and that role, you just check for individual permissions that are very specific to what the user can or cannot do, right? So another thing that is kind of interesting is you can sort of filter the data from the data source and expose only a subset of the data that you want. So for that, we have another sort of customization point in the whole querying and updating pipeline, which we call entity_filter method. And so, for example, you could say, I want to only show data that is from some region, right? So you can say, if the earthquake.region is 33 or whatever, then we will apply that filter to the query. That filter actually gets applied to the expression that goes against the data source. So it's not like we're filtering stuff on the middle tier. We'll actually attach it to whatever query you send through OData. We'll sort of parse this query, attach this filter, send everything back to the data source. The data source will process the query efficiently and then just send us the data that we want. And to show you that this actually works, I'll now add a screen. I could do it in the Power Pivot too, but I want to show you, how the client works when it has something inside. So we have a bunch of templates that cover sort of typical use cases, and you can add your own templates. But I'll just show a grid of data, the simplest possible thing. So hit F5. And now when the application comes up, we expect that the data will only show the earthquakes in the region 33, if there are any. I think there are some in this data set. Boom. Did we get it working? There we go. As I said, it's a development VM. It's a little bit slow. This is not how the real thing works. Okay, so as you can see, all the data that we got is, you can or maybe cannot see. Let me bump up the zoom a little bit. Is from the region 33. And so the interesting thing is that we give you a bunch of stuff for free with our runtime. So for example, we have paging built in, and that works automatically. And if you look at the fiddler, here you may not be able to see it, but we actually use the skip and top operator on the OData service to implement paging. So it's not like our client has some special knowledge. It's the query capabilities are built into our OData service implementation, so you don't have to do it manually, right? That's thanks to the great job that the WCF data services guys have done, which we are using. Another thing is we have some filtering capabilities built in. So for example, if you want to search for earthquakes that just occurred on a particular date, you can do it. Yeah, I'm not sure why this didn't work. But by default, it searches only on the string properties. It doesn't search numerical properties, but you can implement your own search queries. So let's do it next. So you can say, okay, for this entity set, I want to add a query. That query will be exposed as a function import on the OData service. So again, the external clients can call it. So for example, we can have a query that is like earthquakes by date. Right? And we can say, okay, we're going to filter on time, and the time will be between one parameter and another parameter. So we'll add two new parameters, and we'll call it start time and end time, right? And then we can use that query to build another screen that is like search data screen. So let's delete the previous screen because we'll now have a more capable screen that will give us just what we want. See if we can get that to work. Okay, so as you can see, we actually use, we know that those search terms are dates, so we actually have a nice calendar control for that, but I won't use it here because that'll be too much clicking. And so when you change one of the parameters, you get, the query is automatically executed. But you could change it, and you could have a button, and when the user is actually done specifying all the parameters, you could hit it. And again, if you look at what the fiddler is doing, is it's now calling eqdata.svc/earthquakes by date. So that's our function that we just defined without any coding. So finally, I just wanted to show you that these kinds of customizations can be done not only to data that you have in your database, but also to some external data feed as well. So I'll just connect to some feed on the data market, Azure Data Market, and show you that the experience is very similar. In fact, exactly similar, exactly the same. So we'll add another data source, and this time we'll choose the OData service. We don't have a nice picker for the URL, so I'll have to just type it in. So it's Azure data, API data market.azure. So I'll use the utility rate service. That I happen to know and love, but we could use something else. The data market is using live ID by default to identify the user, so I'll use that. But they are also using their own passwords or account keys. So I'll just use that. And then basically, the rest works exactly the same. We download the metadata for the service. In this case, let's say I want all the entities. Why not? And then you can open those entities in the designer and start adding those customizations, adding validation and additional metadata information, and so on and so forth. So that's a quick overview of the demo, what the LightSwitch can do. Any questions or suggestions? Does it look like you might be using that for your data? So the question is, can we publish those applications to SharePoint? Yes. The answer is not in this version, but this is one of the things that we're working on. There's nothing I can announce just yet, but yeah, that's one of the scenarios that will definitely. Today, you can attach to data inside SharePoint, but it's sort of a standalone application, not really hosted in SharePoint. Yes?
Right now it's based on the Silverlight website.
Correct.
And then you have this new release coming up in
Right.
some of the plumbing that's done with the Silverlight, which has JavaScript.
So the question is, we are using Silverlight today for the client. What about HTML JavaScript client? So for the next release of Visual Studio, the client option will still be only Silverlight. That said, we are also working on an HTML client. So I don't have any specific dates, but this is sort of a committed roadmap, not something that we are kind of just thinking about. It's a work in progress. So I just want to quickly show you, this is how LightSwitch architecture looks, basically. As I said, there's client, middle tier, and the service, and the client is, these are the parts that the user is authoring, the screens and data, and the business logic for the data and the screens. And we have the shell, data service. We build on top of OData and WCF data services and use currently Silverlight for the UI, in future HTML, JavaScript. And then we can deploy as a desktop or the browser application. A similar picture is on the middle tier where we have business logic and what we call operation pipelines. And the pipelines are the query pipeline or the update pipeline. That sits on top of OData, currently entity framework for database access. Excuse me. Then we use ASP.NET 4.0 runtime to host our service, and finally, it sits on top of IaaS. And then the data, in terms of data sources that we can talk to, we have relational databases available through entity framework, SharePoint, OData, and custom data sources based on RIA library. So that's where the OData sort of is used. Again, we always talk OData to the client, whether this is a LightSwitch client or third-party client. Our service, of course, produces a service document and produces a metadata. So pretty much any client can that understands OData protocol can talk to it. And then on the service side, we use OData to talk to services, as I was showing you with the utility service, or we can use entity framework or RIA for other data sources. So this is the first question that I had to you. So in our next release, which will be the first release that has OData support in it, we support a bunch of OData features. So we have almost all intrinsic types. We do projections, relationships, validation, imperative or declarative, metadata, and so on and so on. But there's also quite a few OData, especially OData version 3 features that we don't support or don't support fully. And they are listed here. So things like service operations. We can produce service operations, but we really don't consume them. We just consume entity sets if we attach to external data services. Or we don't really handle complex types and inheritance or many-to-many relationships or geospatial types that are new feature of OData v3. So given all that, what would be the most interesting OData features that you would like to see supported? Any suggestions? Okay, what geospatial? Why is that?
I'm an astronomer, so
Okay.
I don't look down, I
Okay. 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 So the name streams is a new feature in OData v3, which basically allows you to associate several blob-like properties with the record. That's what it is, basically. So say you have a record and a bunch of images attached to it, right? And usually you want to retrieve a record, look at the numeric data or whatever, and then decide if the images are interesting or not, right? Okay. Right. That's the idea.
Yeah, this is where the software data. In some cases, you don't want to convert everything into OData feed. It's just not efficient, right?
Right.
So rather you convert them into metadata. That
Right.
metadata allows you to load the images, the streams, all that in the blob.
So, to some extent you can do this today through projections, right? You don't have to retrieve the whole record. But if you have large blobs of data, you may want to totally store it separately from your metadata, right? And then this feature really helps.
Hypermedia?
Mm-hmm.
Is that some feature? I don't see that here. Mike, is hypermedia a feature that we're thinking of adding to OData v3? Yeah.
Media link entries are another way to represent
Right.
Media link entry is when the entry really is the blob, picture, word, something else. And then you may have other properties associated with it.
Right.
That's been in OData. What's added in version 3 is the ability to have multiple stored properties. So they belong either to the media, like when you have a photo, and you may have other streams over a small bitmap or thumbnail or
Right.
other version.
Yeah.
Or they have an entity that is not itself type entity that's the first then properties, name, address, and so forth, and then also stored.
Yeah.
So name streams allow you to have multiple other properties.
Right, exactly. So I thought that's some kind of feature that a lot of people who have like animal tracking kind of, sensor network in the forest that study the, climate or the images from satellites and all that. So, any comments, questions?
When is LightSwitch coming out?
Together with Visual Studio 2012, which is, we don't know.
Okay, here's another general question. How many of you use Studio? Very encouraging.
Yeah.
Much
Very
better than I thought.
Yeah.
So, Visual Studio 2010, the latest, right? That you're on? Yeah. So, if you're from universities, you're entitled to get a free copy of the full version of Visual Studio 10. If you don't have it, let me know. You should already have it.
I have one more question. So, once we got our initial implementation going, we started to test it with a bunch of feeds. And we noticed that the level of implementation of the OData protocol is actually varies quite a bit. Because the spec doesn't really say, to be an OData feed, you have to implement this and that, right? And LightSwitch applications, by default, try to give you some reasonable experience for retrieving and editing data. So we implement the paging and sorting and things like that. And that translates into specific functionality that we expect from the OData feed. So for paging, we expect that top and skip operators, query operators are implemented. For sorting, order by is implemented, and so on and so forth. And we find out that it's really, really all over the place. We are starting to work on some sort of, to remedy that, some sort of capability vocabulary that you would be able to associate with your metadata and say, these are the capabilities that the feed supports. But you would also like to, be able to test as many feeds as possible. So my question is, did you encounter a feed that was sort of looking promising, but then you run into trouble? Maybe you can share your story. And B, if you have a feed that you would like to, have us test, then by all means, contact me. Yes, question. Right. 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 Right.
If that's a great question. I think Mike, if we start that, the community will catch up and they will contribute. This is one way that we can get everybody to help.
Vocabularies allow you to add additional information, either metadata or data. One of the first vocabularies is defining synthesis vocabulary, allow you to add additional information, describing support, earlier support, things like that. And we would love to get feedback from you guys as far as you say, you go either way from a very granular profile, one of which we have now, which is all or nothing, and it's not very useful, all the way down to something so granular that you have to check for every single thing you're trying to do, and that's not useful either. It doesn't give any guidance around what things should be supported. So we're looking both at defining profiles, so that there are a pretty small discrete number of profiles that people can target, and also defining individual capabilities to this round. We'd love to get feedback from you guys as to the features of OData on the producer side, which are harder to produce in some scenarios based on the underlying source of data and the way that you're interacting with it. And from the client side, what are the critical things that are paging that you come.
Right. So if you're shy, you're not speaking out here, you can always email us. So at that alias, E3ENV, that's the alias that we've been sending you everything about this event. And that will reach out to all of us at Microsoft who's willing to help and hear from you. Otherwise, yeah, speak out.
One of the feeds I think that would be really important, and I was going to Google myself to see what was available, but actually came up this morning when Stream Insight was being discussed, which is the data feed from process control. And so there are multiple standards, but the OPC 2.0 and OPC 3.0, which are actually based on Microsoft And so my question would be, would there be an OData provider or feed that comes from an OPC server so that it's easy to consume the process control information back into, say, a Silverlight app that's created by LightSwitch? I mean, that would be really phenomenal because today you spend a lot of time trying to buy either a third-party OPC driver.
Right.
and
Exactly.
things like that.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, not exactly.
In that
Process
case.
control comes in the environment also. So I didn't know, for example, on Google, if you guys already had an OPC.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that or any or those standards for that matter. But that's a good question. I took an I'll look it up.
Email us as well,
Yeah.
so we can follow up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
my email is, by the way, at the top. And John Rivard is our architect and also a very friendly guy. So please don't hesitate to email us with questions or suggestions. We always want to hear more from users. Anyway, that's all I had to say about LightSwitch. Any other questions maybe or?
Yeah, otherwise you can always catch up offline. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you very much.